maybe you haven't prayed for years and you feel bad about it. If you don't know why you can't get yourself to do it, there's this funk around spiritual practices. There's something that keeps you from engaging in a deep level that's meaningful. But the hard part is that you know you love God. You just feel that your ability to draw near is blocked. There's something in the way. Here's the catch. You may not be crazy. It may actually just be the logical conclusion of some things that you believe regarding God's grace and salvation. At least, that's how it was for me. We're going to talk about spiritual disciplines broadly. But as Dana and I were prepping, something came up that we needed to talk about, or I needed to talk about. And it was, I'll start with myself and then I'll talk a little more broadly. So I mentioned this in our episode with Penn Jillette, where Dan and I briefly talked about spiritual disciplines. And what I said was, I used to think of the spiritual disciplines or God's grace on me, getting these warm, fuzzy feelings, my desires changing so that, I want to do things that are righteous, not things that are sinful, would be a passive action, or it would just flow over me like the ocean, regardless if I was in the water or not. And the point I made in that episode was that when you sit down and pray, when I sit down and pray, when I try and turn the phone off, when I try and not play music when I get in the car so that I can pray when I'm in the car, or when I'm trying to read the Bible and not look at my phone or, be distracted. That's something that I actually have to do. I have to sit there and I have to be silent. I have to leave my phone in the other room or turn it off. I have to say the prayer, do the thing to participate in the spiritual discipline, as opposed to thinking that the results of these disciplines will just passively happen to me. And I've been experiencing that more acutely, more recently. And the thing I've been struck by is how a lot of this comes to how we talk about God's grace towards us. Many times when we talk about grace, we see it as, we see grace as an abundance of God's forgiveness to us. We see it as an extension of our forgiveness and as a release from the punishment of our sinful actions. And so, if we're going to say that I am saved by grace through faith alone, if you have that idea of grace in your head, then doing the disciplines actually doesn't do anything for you in reception of God's grace.
Worse than that, doing the disciplines is kind of heretical in that framework, because that implies that you have to do something in order to receive the forgiveness.
Right.
And so it's not just that we live in a culture that doesn't have a category for the disciplines. It's that the Christian culture that we've constructed in our society is one that sees anything that resembles the disciplines as being counterproductive to properly understanding the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
The disciplines are actually a hindrance.
Yes.
In that mindset.
And again, you might think, we'll get back to this. You might think it's a good thing to sit and read your Bible. You might think it's a good thing to pray. You might think it's it's worthwhile fasting. But this is why so many people deconstruct when they get older. This is why I went through my long period of this, was because it came in my head and I thought, well, if I'm just saved, if the thing is that I pray this prayer, whatever that means, and I really mean whatever that means, to most people, to accept Jesus, whatever that means, and I'm now, in Willard's analogy, have the barcode of Jesus on me, and the goal is that I get to heaven, and that barcode gets scanned, and it just reads Jesus. No matter how much I actually look like Jesus, then doing the disciplines, praying, fasting, being like giving to the poor people, spending time with, getting rid of my anger and Jesus' words, getting rid of my lust, getting rid of my pride, getting rid of my neediness to be seen by others. All of that is just unnecessary. And think about it, it's actually unnecessary. If the whole thing is the right leaning gospel and I am saved by the barcode of Jesus Christ to get through the gates of heaven. And so I think many of us didn't pray for years because I thought it doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything anyway. Why would I do that? I'm not changing God's mind. And if anything, I wanted to pray so that I wanted to pray because I knew I was probably being bad. And so I needed to feel God's grace, i.e., feel like I was emotional enough to be forgiven for the bad things I had done, which then goes back to this comment I made a few times on this podcast, that the way I measured successful prayer was my emotional attachment to it, or a successful time in a worship service was my ecstatic experience towards it, because that meant that I felt God's grace in the sense that I felt forgiven. But even at that, again, it's not necessary because I already had God's grace. I already was forgiven. So I didn't need, that was just extra. That was so that I could like bring it down at least far enough so that I could feel it in my head or like through my eyes, like quite literally. And so that's how I used to pray. I used to pray because I wanted to feel the grace of God in feeling bad about the thing I had done. And that's what it meant. Like I prayed so that I could feel bad about my sinfulness. Not because I actually didn't want to be sinful. The like 30 minutes later, after I have my cry in the closet, I'm back to, oh, it does, like, it's not a big deal. I'm fine. I'll be okay. I'll just pray harder next time so I can feel more forgiven. So I didn't believe it actually did anything. It just accrued the current state that was already on me, whatever that means. Whereas now, so if we don't see, if seeing grace as like an abundance of God's forgiveness, if seeing grace is merely that, I don't think that's right. There's this, and this is an again, I'm going to speak of the tradition I'm in. Like this Eastern picture of God's grace is the sun. Think of God like the sun. You have the rays that come from the sun are like God's grace. And why there's an emphasis on practices and their utility and their actual function, rather than making you feel bad, is to put you in the sun. Because I always thought, I go in my closet, I pray, or or not, and I'm just in the sun, even if it's raining outside. Because again, it was passive. Like I didn't have to do anything. The sun's just going to shine on me, and that's fine. But I can't, as much as I can't will from my molecular cells a tan to like darken my skin. I can't will God's grace hard enough in my life that it saves me. But what I can do is I can pray. I can fast. I can enter into silence. I can do practice. I can go to church. I can do practices that put me in the sun. And the more I'm in the sun, the more that I am exposed to the grace of God. And again, we know this the opposite way around. The less I do those things, the more I want it to rain. The less I want to be in the sun. And again, I'm just trying to bring this out because I used to pray because I wanted to feel bad about the things I had done, because I felt like I needed to feel God's forgiveness. Now I'm trying to, emphasis on trying, now I'm trying to pray so that I don't do those things anymore. Right? I used to pray so that I would feel bad about being lustful or watching porn. Now I pray so that I become the kind of person that doesn't want, as Penn Jillette talks about with his diet, doesn't want those things anymore. Where I used to think that me praying for that's just woo woo, it's magic. Like that's not going to happen. That's reserved for other Christians because that's not how God's grace works. But as a matter of fact, I think it is exactly how it works.
And notice that what you're talking about is it's a different way of thinking about salvation. We're going to talk about ways of thinking in a little bit, but it's a different way of thinking about salvation. It's not just salvation from eternal damnation. It's a salvation from the things that you're dealing with right now in your life.
Right.
Dealing with your life. And that comes from a conviction and a belief that God isn't just up here, right? Floating in the ether somewhere. God's wanting and willing to be in the dirt with you and save you from the things that are making you dirty.
Right. And even this, I don't remember if he uses this, talks about God's grace in this way, but how I'm trying to talk now is very analogous to chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
Living in a God-bathed world, right? If you don't think that the actual world is bathed with the presence of God, then it's in this sense would be like is all ways in which God can manifest and mediate his grace to you.
Yeah.
Then of course you're just going to pray to feel bad. It's just how it's going to work for you.
Yeah. So let's keep it moving a little bit. There's one thing that I want to say. One of the things that you're talking about is this like idea of having a habit that prevents you from getting in the sun, having the light of God shine on you. Right? And
sorry, I have to make this point.
Yeah.
Or before I would pray or enter into a practice so that it was totally negative. So that I just wouldn't do that thing.
Yes.
So like I feel tempted, I feel drawn to whatever it is, or I get angry or I feel whatever. And it's like, oh, I'm going to pray so that I don't feel angry, or I'm just going to pray so that I don't feel lustful.
Yeah.
Where it's like, sometimes that direct attack is not the best idea, actually.
Also, here's the thing. This comes from, I want to say it's the opening of The Weight of Glory, maybe, where Lewis talks about how if you ask most classic Christians, I think I've said this on the podcast before, if you ask most classic Christians throughout history, what is the highest virtue? They'd say love. But if you ask most people now, they'd say self-control. And his point is that we've switched a positive for a negative. Self-control is about denying myself something. love is about willing something for the other. And so we've taken what was an expressive and expansive thing, and we've turned it into a vacuum. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why the practices, it's funny, we've turned it into a vacuum, but what we do, and play the Shia clip for this, what we do is we create a theological vacuum that we then fill with the busyness of modern contemporary life.
Right, because it's passive.
Yes.
Or at the most, it'll just stop me from doing the bad thing.
Yes. So I'm going to play this clip from Shia real quick. And then is that coming through all right?
Mm-hmm.
Good. I'll play this real quick, and then we can talk about this and something that Lewis says that's similar.
So I call my dude up, and he's like, bro, you got to let go. You got to let go in full. And I want to get in my car, and I drive up to Utah. And I'm in Utah for 3 months. And while I'm in Utah, they take my cell phone from me. And if they didn't take my cell phone from me, I was never going to be able to deal with what I needed to deal with. I had never known how to pray because I could never cultivate silence. I had no absence in my life. Every unforgiving minute was full of some fucking scroll or some more like ego feed, constant, nonstop rotation of this ego thing and that ego thing and just constant fulfillment of like my own personal desires. And they took my phone from me. And just for that reason alone, I would urge anybody to go this route if you're in a situation like mine, just to get the fucking phone out of your pocket. And what that gave me was time to like really assess what had been my operating systems. What had been like the motivational force in my life, which was always me. It was always ego. It was always
even the smallest decision to even go into
everything.
food, to everything you eat,
everything was ego. Everything was ego. I would eat that not because it tasted good, but because it would do this or do that, you know. And so I was there for 90 days, and in that 90 days, I made a list of all these people that I had hurt, and I mean a bunch of shit happened.
I think that basically gets the point across.
Yeah.
But his point is that there was no absence in his life. He filled every moment with something.
Mm-hmm.
That way he could distract himself from all of the problems.
Right.
And we live in a culture that's all about filling. And as the church, this is Willard's point in this chapter, is that the church right now is full of practices that are all about filling space. Study and worship. That's all we really do at church. We fill space up.
Mm-hmm.
But if you
and we brag about
water,
filling the space up.
and we brag about filling space up with the right stuff. And it is the right stuff. But the problem is, if you pour water into a full glass, it just runs over. None of it stays in the glass. And the thing is, we're pouring good spiritual teaching and worship mentality into people who are full of different things.
Right.
And one of the reasons why people like John Mark Comer, who we used a clip from last time, Dallas Willard, who's now growing in popularity, all of these people, and a ton of people who talk about these spiritual practices, the reason they're growing in popularity is because we live in a culture right now that's overflowing, and the spiritual practices, they do incorporate this filling, but they also incorporate an emptying. And this emptying is found in silence and solitude, in fasting, in things like that, where you take a break, you strip off all of the exterior. Willard talks about you make sure that you expose all your, he calls them epidermal responses, the instinctual responses that are naturally produced by the way that you've been habituated in the world. You expose them so that you can find the bad ones and kill them.
Right.
And he talks about it in the language of killing too, right? Because that he calls this the small death to self, the crucifixion that Jesus talks about. Die to self and rise with him. It is a small version of that. And that's what these spiritual practices are about doing. And when we talk about grace and do you need to do anything, and we're so hesitant about works salvation, saved by grace alone. we ignore the fact that Jesus said, if you do not die to self, you will have no part of me.
Right. The one who hears these words and does them is like
Yes.
a wise man.
Yes.
And so even in my own life, I see this. I see Shia in me, because even in this change of mind about what happened, what's happening, something's actually happening when I pray. Something's actually happening when I fast. Something's actually happening when I go to church. Something's actually happening when I engage myself in these disciplines, when I read, when I do these things. I'm putting myself in the sun. But it's so hard to give. I heard something recently that talked about, call them liminal spaces, right? You're at the bus stop, if any of you ever ride the bus, or you're driving somewhere, right? You're in between locations. You're in this liminal space, or you're doing the dishes, or you're making dinner. You're walking from the parking lot at work to the front door. The advice was, pray during those times. And that's something I've took upon myself, because I find it so difficult to make 5 minutes at night to pray, because I walk from the couch to the kitchen to get something from the fridge, and I think, oh, it's about 20 seconds. That's like a couple Instagram videos. Ooh, let me scroll a couple and like sit there with the fridge open and my arm on it, and then my roommate's like, "What are you looking for?" I'm like, "I don't remember anymore. I don't know what I was doing." Or even worse, have something that I want to watch on the TV, and I think, this is getting a little boring. Let me pull out my phone, watch the little screen. Ooh, nice little images. Other than the thing I actually wanted to focus on. So like I can't even entertain myself long enough to not entertain myself with something else. And then I go to bed and I sleep in the bed with my phone next to me watching this YouTube video that's about something that I don't care about, won't remember in 3 days, but I just need the noise so I can fall asleep. No wonder I can't get in the sun. No wonder I can't read my Bible for 5. No wonder I can't say the Jesus prayer 10 times. No wonder I can't do that, because my life is full of some effing scroll all the time. All the time. I'm in the car, I'm playing music. I'm listening to a podcast. I carry my Bluetooth headphones with me, or earphones with me, everywhere. So that when I go to the grocery store, when I could have some time where I'm menially doing a task and like have some time so my brain can think, or going to the gym, I have them in and I'm listening. So I don't have to interrupt with any human beings, because I just want to think about the thing I was thinking about that I was listening to when I was in the car. I want I want no liminal space between me not being a consumer, of me not being entertained, of me not, and it's not all just entertainment. Like it's fun stuff. It's fun stuff I find interesting, right? Regardless, it's all input. I can't have a moment that's not input. So yeah, I don't know silence. Yeah, I don't know abstinence from any kind of stimulus.
Yeah.
It's impossible. And so I'm trying to be in the sun more. And that means that I get in the car and I pause the music and I count on my fingers and I pray the Jesus prayer 10 times before I ever listen to anything. When I'm walking from the car to the front door of work, I pray the Jesus prayer a couple of times. It's just, I'm trying to train myself. I have to fill every second with something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then hopefully that doesn't become just 3 minutes. Hopefully it become 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And so, again, because I actually think that being in the sun, putting myself in a position to encounter the grace of God will actually do something to me.
Yeah.
It will change me.
Yeah. Well, and that it's not just the passive action that you've been talking about, like
Right.
this passivity that we just receive grace, and that and we receive all of these things from God, and we're so against actually doing something. And so I want to read something from Thomas Aquinas real quick,
Go
that
ahead.
Luke, I read to you a little while ago, that I think is really important from this, on this point.
I just want to make this one statement really quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I made this to you before we just started recording, but I think the problem so many people have with this idea of the disciplines and them actually doing something is because they get the idea of God's power wrong.
Yes. Yes.
They think that God actually doesn't have any self, to use the negative and out, like
Mhm.
God has no restraint.
Yes.
The question I've been asking recently to myself is, will God transform me against my own will? I think the answer is no. And so me putting myself in the sun, wanting to get the tan of transformation, to like really bastardize this analogy, but like I think it actually does something because it's actually putting me in a place where, veiled as it might be by his grace, by his grace, I come in contact with that power.
Yeah.
And slowly, it's doing something.
Yep.
But I also have to step into the sun. I have to get out from under the clouds. I have to turn the phone off. I have to, not play the music. I have to pause the podcast. I have to actually open up the Bible.
Yeah. So in this point, I think I want to make a point on this that'll transition great into Aquinas. Part of the reason why I think that we're so hesitant to do anything is this like grace theology that we have, but it's also the hyper intellectualization that we have. We see ourselves as brains with bodies, not fully integrated human beings.
Right.
And so one of the reasons why you wanted to whip yourself into an emotional frenzy in prayer
To feel the forgiveness of the grace of God
is to like, yeah, and feel the thing, is because I think emotion is the lowest form of a like disembodied intellectualness that still isn't concrete. And the concreteness makes us uncomfortable, because if it's real, if it's material, then it can't be from God, right? And if it's real and it's material, then it implies that we are in some way working or doing. And so we have this real uncomfortability with that, right? But so the Pentecostals, right? Tradition I grew up in, we would have this hyper emotionalized service because we knew that it's by grace alone, but we wanted it to be concrete and real in some way, not just abstracted, not just theory, not just high theology. And that's the lowest form of high theology, of like an abstraction that can really feel rooted. But if you recognize that God created the world with all of its particulars and can use the world and all of its particulars to instill grace within us, then something switches. So let's read some Aquinas. This is the third part of the Summa Theologia, question 61. He says, sacraments are necessary for human salvation for 3 reasons. Now, that already is a controversial statement. So I'm coming out the gate hot, and I know that. But hang with me, because he's going somewhere. The first is taken from the condition of human nature, which is such that it has to be led by bodily and perceptible things to spiritual and intellectual things. So that's what I'm talking about here, right? We have this abstracted theology, and we keep feeling like we need something that can like pull us up there. And so we use the lowest thing that our theology allows us to pull us up. But it's not a healthy way of doing it. It is characteristic of divine providence to provide for each thing according to the requirements of its condition. What he means by that is God created us as material beings. And so God providentially and graciously will use things that are material to help us along the path of grace. And therefore, divine wisdom fittingly provided human beings with aids to salvation in the shape of bodily and perceptible signs that are called sacraments. So his point is that the sacraments are these physical things, a visible sign of an invisible reality. It's a visible, tangible thing that leads us down this path of grace. The second reason is that from the state of human beings who in sinning subjected themselves by their desires to bodily things, now the healing remedy should be given to a person so as to reach the part affected by the disease. Consequently,
this is, I think, his most, like, my favorite thing he says here.
yes. Consequently, it was fitting that God should provide human beings with spiritual medicine by means of certain bodily signs. For if one were offered unveiled spiritual things, one would be unable to apply one's mind to them because it would be taken up with the material world. And so he's saying that
You also couldn't handle it.
yes, you couldn't handle it. You literally couldn't handle it. And so the physical thing helps lead you along the path like medicine. And it's the same kind of thing as the problem that we have. We have a physical material problem and a spiritual problem. But that spiritual problem is wrapped up in our physical material particularity. And so he prescribes a medicine to help fix that problem. The third reason is taken from the general inclination of human actions towards bodily things. Therefore, so that it should not be too hard for human beings to be drawn away entirely from bodily actions, bodily activity was offered to them in the sacraments, by which they might be trained to avoid superstitious practices, consisting in the worship of demons, and all manner of harmful actions, consisting in sinful deeds. So that third point is that our sinful actions are concrete, and so can our sacred actions be. And the separation, right? The thought that, well, sacred action is just belief and mental assent to some principles and faith, but all sinful actions, that is all bodily and material, and it's wrapped up in like all of our humanness. That is not Christianity. That's Gnostic heresy. Straight, clear-cut Gnostic heresy. The idea that the spiritual is better and the body is like, no, none of that stuff. Get that out of here. And so these practices, they help us, the disciplines. We don't do the spiritual disciplines because we don't think we need to, right? It's because salvation in the Protestant world, we don't do them because we don't think we need to in order to earn salvation. But maybe there's something more going on. Maybe they help us mediate between our principles and our particular, the way that we need to. Any comments?
I think, like many people, I'll say it this way. I'll try and be quick. I think many
I've got
people
some closing thoughts.
I think many people only think of sin as legal wrongdoing.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a much more ancient, much more Eastern view that sin is sickness.
Yeah.
I'm starting to realize how sick I am. And so I have to do something.
And
God's
given you medicine to address that sickness.
Right.
That's what Thomas is saying. So Willard, he talks about the discipline as any activity within our willpower that we can engage in that enables us to do more than direct effort can accomplish, right? That's what a practice is. But he also talks about how, that's kind of earthly bodily, right? But it's also spiritual. It is a spiritual discipline. It's not just a discipline. And that these disciplines are designed to help us move our hearts along the path in the spiritual sense. But again, the point I've made, and this is coming from Willard, is that it's kind of ironic that all of the spiritual disciplines are or essentially involve bodily behavior. But it's, as Thomas says, it makes perfect sense because we're bodily beings.
Right. All your sinful behavior has happened at some level in your body.
Yes. But the body.
So why wouldn't your
Yes.
why wouldn't your sanctification
also happen in your body?
In your body.
Shouldn't it?
I mean, yeah.
The rejection of the body, I think, it is classic Gnostic heresy, but it's also the downfall of the modern Christian perspective. Because when you discount the very nature, the very way God has made us, you start dealing with all of the problems that we have in ways that aren't well calibrated for the way God designed us.
Mm-hmm.
And the spiritual disciplines are calibrated for the way God designed us, to be means through which grace can flow to us. Aquinas also talks about how, he talks about they're necessary for salvation. Let me make a quick note on that before we end. He talks about how they're necessary like a hammer is necessary in the hand of a craftsman. Yes, the hammer builds the table, but it only builds the table because the craftsman's using the hammer.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the sacrament is necessary for your salvation, but it's only necessary for your salvation because God is wielding the sacrament.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like
or God is in the sacrament. I'll just say that.
Yes. It's not like we get the sacrament apart from God and our salvation's coming from somewhere else. No, that's the opposite. God wields the sacrament to be a bodily representation of transforming us further into his image. That's what's going on.
If this gets cut, it gets cut. We say the creed every week in my church. We hope for the resurrection of the dead and life in the world to come. You can't think that your salvation just happens in your mind if you believe that. And we'll talk more.